The first time I held my daughter, I thought the world would stop. Her tiny fingers curled instinctively around mine, her eyes still closed, her breaths soft and uncertain. The delivery room smelled faintly of antiseptic, but beneath it there was something else, a warmth, a fragile newness that seemed to hum in the air. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times during my pregnancy, but the reality was deeper, heavier, almost unbearable in its beauty. My husband, Daniel, stood beside me, his arm tight around my shoulders, his expression unreadable. I noticed the absence before I had the strength to name it. No flowers in the corner from his parents, no familiar faces hovering at the door, no gentle knocks to ask if they could come in. My parents had passed years ago, and Daniel's were the only grandparents our child would have. We had sent the message when I went into labor, and Daniel had called them himself just after midnight, voice trembling with excitement. They had promised to come, but hours passed and no one appeared. By the time we were moved to a private recovery room, exhaustion was setting in. The nurse wheeled in a cart with my first meal since labor, and I watched Daniel glance at his phone for the 50th time. His jaw tightened. He typed something quickly, then set the phone face down. "They're not coming tonight," he said finally, eyes on the linoleum floor. I waited for him to explain. When he didn't, I asked quietly, "Are they all right?" He replied, "They're fine." But the way he said it told me he didn't believe it was fine at all. They just said it's late and they'll see the baby, quote, "when it's convenient." Something in me shifted then. A click, like a lock sliding into place. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I just held my daughter closer, inhaling her scent, and thought, convenient. As if she were an errand to run. The first few days at the hospital blurred together in a haze of feedings, checkups, and learning to swaddle. Daniel's parents sent a bouquet on the third day, as if that could bridge the distance they'd created. It came with a card that read, "Congratulations, we'll meet her soon." No names, just their handwriting as cold and clipped as their voices on the few calls they had made to Daniel. When we were finally discharged, it was raining. The sky was low and heavy, the kind of gray that made the hospital's concrete walls look even more severe. As we strapped our daughter into the car seat for the first time, Daniel avoided my eyes. I knew he was carrying a quiet guilt, though he hadn't done anything wrong. This was about them, their choice. Weeks passed. Our daughter, whom we named Lila, began to open her eyes more, to study the shapes and lights around her. She was growing so fast that I started to take pictures every day, afraid I'd miss some small change. Every evening, I sent a photo to Daniel's parents. They never replied. Once, they hearted one of the messages. That was all. The first time I asked Daniel why they hadn't visited yet, he told me not to take it personally. He said, "They're busy. They have their own lives." "But we're their family," I said. And even as the words left my mouth, I felt how fragile they were. It wasn't until Lila was almost 2 months old that the truth came out. Daniel had gone to see them alone, hoping to talk to them in person. When he came back, he sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped so tightly they were white. He told me they said they're not ready to be grandparents. They think it's better to stay uninvolved. They don't want the responsibility. I stared at him, the words not fitting into any world I understood. Responsibility? I echoed. They don't have to raise her. They just have to love her. He said, they think it's better this way. His voice cracking. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I sat in the living room with Lila, sleeping on my chest. The moonlight through the blinds cut across the floor in thin silver lines. I thought about how some people build walls so high they can't see the life blooming just on the other side. And I decided I wouldn't let their absence shrink my daughter's world. If they didn't want to be part of her life, fine. But they would never erase themselves from the story entirely. Not if I could help it. It started as a small idea, one I kept to myself at first. Our local hospital had been running a campaign to raise funds for a new maternity wing, and I'd been quietly donating since I found out I was pregnant. It was my way of giving back, of honoring the nurses and doctors who made Lila's safe arrival possible. But now I saw an opportunity for something bigger. When the hospital's fundraising committee invited me to a meeting about major donors, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I sat there listening to the plans for the wing, the layout of the rooms, the nameplates for the contributors. And when they asked if I'd like my donation to be anonymous or credited, I smiled. I said, I'd like it credited to the Thomas and Margaret Ellison Maternity Wing. Daniel's parents' names. There was a murmur in the room, but no one questioned it. Why would they? It sounded like a beautiful gesture, in honor for the grandparents. Only I knew the truth. Every time someone walked into that wing, every time a new life was brought into the world there, their names would be spoken, not because they earned it, but because I gave it to them. The day the press release went out, Daniel's phone lit up with messages from his parents. I could hear their voices, tight with confusion, through the speaker. They said, "Why would you do this? We didn't ask for this." "No," I said, taking the phone from Daniel. "You didn't ask for her either." There was a long silence. And then, just before his mother hung up, she said, "You'll regret this." But I didn't. Not then. Not ever. Because I had only just begun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you.
The phone call with his mother replayed in my mind for days after. Not in sharp bursts of anger, but in slow, deliberate echoes that made me think of it at night, long after Lila was asleep. I kept wondering how two people could stand at the threshold of something as pure as a newborn's life and turn away without so much as a touch. My chest ached at the thought that their absence might one day feel like Lila's loss. But I wouldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let her grow up thinking love was something that had to be earned. Daniel was quieter than usual. He didn't fight me on the maternity wing naming, but he didn't praise me for it either. Sometimes I'd catch him watching Lila with a faint, sad smile, as if he were already imagining the conversations she might have when she was old enough to ask why her grandparents weren't around. 3 weeks after the press release, I got an invitation from the hospital to attend the groundbreaking ceremony for the new wing. They wanted major donors front and center. I almost didn't tell Daniel. There was a petty, stubborn part of me that wanted to walk onto that stage alone, to own the moment without the shadow of his parents' disapproval hanging over us. But then I pictured Lila someday hearing about this, and I decided both her parents should be there. The morning of the ceremony was bright and crisp, one of those early spring days where the air still holds a trace of winter's bite. I dressed Lila in a soft white onesie and wrapped her in the knitted blanket my mother had made for me when I was a baby. Daniel held her as we walked toward the small crowd gathered by the construction site. The hospital's CEO greeted us warmly. Cameras flashed, local reporters scribbled notes. A large easel covered with a white cloth stood to one side of the podium. I already knew what was underneath, the artist's rendering of the new wing with the Thomas and Margaret Ellison maternity wing etched proudly over the main entrance. When it was my turn to speak, I took the podium with Leela in my arms. The wind tugged gently at her blanket, and she blinked up at the crowd with sleepy disinterest. I spoke about the importance of community, about how no child should enter the world without being surrounded by care, love, and dignity. I didn't mention Daniel's parents directly, but my words were edged with the truth I carried. Afterwards, as people milled about the chatter, a voice cut through the chatter, a voice I knew too well. Is this supposed to be some kind of joke? I turned to see them. Thomas and Margaret Ellison, standing just beyond the edge of the crowd. They looked exactly as they had the last time I'd seen them, but something in their eyes was different. Not softened, no, that would have been too much to hope for, but sharper, as if my gesture had pierced whatever armor they'd been wearing. It's not a joke, I said calmly. It's a gift. Margaret's lips thinned. We didn't agree to this. You didn't have to. It's already done. They stayed for only a few minutes, speaking mostly to Daniel in low tones I couldn't hear, but their presence that day sparked a chain reaction I couldn't have predicted. The local paper ran a photo from the ceremony on its front page the next morning. There I was, holding Leela, Daniel beside me, and, just in the background, his parents, caught mid-conversation. The caption listed all our names, including theirs. It was the first time in months they'd been publicly associated with us. Calls started coming in. Old friends of theirs reached out, congratulating them on their beautiful granddaughter and praising their generosity. The narrative was slipping out of their control, and I could see the discomfort in every clipped text they sent to Daniel. 2 weeks later, the hospital called again. They were hosting a gala to raise additional funds for the wing, and they wanted me, and by extension, the Ellisons, to attend as guests of honor. I didn't hesitate. We'll be there. The night of the gala, I wore a deep navy gown that clung just enough to make me feel powerful without being showy. Daniel wore his best suit. Leela stayed home with a sitter for the first time, and though I felt a pang of guilt leaving her, I knew this night wasn't for her. It was for the story we were telling. When we arrived, the Ellisons were already there. Margaret's dress was immaculate, her pearls gleaming under the chandelier light. Thomas looked stiff in his tuxedo, like he'd rather be anywhere else. But the moment we stepped into the ballroom, the cameras found us. We posed together, the four of us, because the donors wanted their photos and the story wouldn't work without the illusion of their parents' support. Dinner was a blur of speeches, applause, and polite laughter. When the time came for the main presentation, the lights dimmed and a video played on the large screen at the front of the room. It showed footage of the construction site, interviews with nurses and doctors, and photos from the groundbreaking. And then, there it was. The rendering of the wing, our names gleaming in gold letters. Margaret shifted in her seat. Thomas cleared his throat. Daniel's hand found mine under the table, squeezing just enough to say, I know what you're doing. After the applause died down, the hospital director invited all four of us onto the stage. I could feel the heat of the spotlights, the weight of hundreds of eyes. I spoke first, thanking the staff and the community for their support. When I finished, I turned to Margaret and Thomas. Would you like to say a few words? I asked, my tone sweet, innocent. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed again. Finally, she said, We're honored, thank you. It was brief, stiff, but it was on the record, and the crowd applauded as if she'd recited a poem. In the weeks that followed, their behavior began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways. They sent a card for Leela's 3-month milestone. They commented on a photo Daniel posted of her in a little yellow dress. And one sunny afternoon, they appeared at our door unannounced. Daniel froze when he saw them. I stepped forward. May we come in? Margaret asked. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard her. I looked at Leela, who was gnawing on a teething ring in her bouncer,
then back at them. Of course. They stayed for an hour. They didn't hold her, not yet, but they watched her, and I saw something flicker in their expressions. Not regret, exactly, but maybe the first spark of understanding. After they left, Daniel exhaled as if he had been holding his breath the whole time. "Do you think this will last?" he asked. I didn't answer, because the truth was, I had no idea. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't done. And the next step in my plan was already unfolding. It began with a phone call from the hospital director. They wanted to know if I'd be interested in serving on the fundraising board permanently. It would mean more events, more public appearances, more opportunities to shape the story. I accepted before she finished her sentence. If the Ellisons wouldn't come willingly into Leela's life, I'd create a world where they couldn't avoid her. And soon, that world would be bigger than any of us.
The first meeting of the fundraising board took place in the hospital's newly renovated conference room, its glass walls offering a view of the maternity ward's courtyard. The air inside hummed with quiet ambition, the kind of energy that made people speak in polished tones, always measuring their words. Around the table were a dozen faces, some I recognized from previous events, others new. I felt the weight of their attention when the hospital director introduced me. "This is Claire," she said, resting a hand lightly on my shoulder. "She's the benefactor behind our new maternity wing." A few polite nods, a couple of curious glances. I could almost hear the mental math, who I was, how much I'd given, what my story must be. I didn't offer any more than necessary. The power, I'd learned, was in letting people wonder. As the meeting unfolded, I realized how influential this board truly was. They decided not just on fundraising strategies, but on community outreach, partnerships with local businesses, even the hiring of certain staff. It wasn't just about money. It was about shaping the hospital's public identity. When the agenda shifted to upcoming projects, the director turned to me. "Claire, would you be interested in spearheading the annual charity gala this year? You've shown such initiative." I smiled. "I'd be happy to." The room murmured approval, and just like that, I had the perfect stage for my next move. The gala was 6 months away, enough time to plan something unforgettable. My vision was clear from the start, an event so grand, so intertwined with the Ellison name that they'd have no choice but to attend, no matter how they felt about me. The maternity wing would still be under construction by then, but the gala would celebrate the progress, and every photograph, every news story would place them squarely in the frame. At home, Daniel was cautiously supportive. He said one evening as I sketched out ideas at the dining table, "I just don't want this to become too much." I asked, not looking up, "Too much for who?" He hesitated. "For us, for Lila." I set down my pen. "This is for Lila. She's going to grow up knowing that she was never a secret, never an afterthought. She'll see that even if some people tried to stay away, her life still mattered enough to change this community." He didn't argue after that. In the months that followed, I poured myself into the planning. I secured the city's most sought-after ballroom, booked a renowned jazz quartet, arranged for a celebrity chef to design the menu. Every detail was deliberate. The invitations were printed on thick cream stock, the lettering embossed in gold. At the bottom, just above the RSVP line, was the phrase, "Proceeds to benefit the Thomas and Margaret Ellison Maternity Wing." When the invitations went out, I imagined Margaret opening hers. I pictured the slight widening of her eyes, the tight press of her lips. She wouldn't decline, not with their names on every piece of marketing material. Pride was a powerful motivator. Sure enough, their RSVP arrived 2 weeks later. Formal acceptance, no note. The night of the gala, I arrived early to oversee final preparations. The ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers, the air fragrant with roses and peonies arranged in tall glass vases.
A massive banner hung above the stage, the Ellison name gleaming in the spotlight. Guests began arriving in sleek cars, stepping out in gowns and tailored suits. I greeted them at the entrance, Lila in my arms for the first hour, until the sitter arrived to take her home for the night. People cooed overheard, took photos, asked about her milestones. Each time, I made sure to mention her full name, Lila Grace Ellison. When Thomas and Margaret arrived, the photographers descended instantly. Margaret's dress was a deep emerald, her hair perfectly set. Thomas looked every bit the distinguished businessman. They posed stiffly for photos with me, their smiles tight but present. In every shot, our names and the maternity wing's logo filled the background. Dinner was followed by speeches. I spoke first, weaving a story about the importance of community in welcoming new life. My voice was steady, my gaze sweeping the room, pausing just long enough on the Ellisons to let everyone notice. Then came the moment I'd been building toward. "It's my great honor," I said, "to invite Thomas and Margaret Ellison to the stage. Without their legacy, this project would not be possible." The applause was thunderous. They couldn't refuse. They walked up, Margaret's hand resting lightly on Thomas's arm. At the podium, Margaret spoke briefly, thanking the community for their support. Thomas followed with a few generic remarks about family and future generations, but the cameras caught it all. After the speeches, guests mingled, wine glasses in hand. I noticed Margaret speaking with the hospital director, her expression softening as she glanced at me across the room. It was subtle, but it was there. A shift. By the end of the night, pledges for the maternity wing had exceeded our goal. The event was deemed a resounding success in every local paper, with photos of the Ellisons splashed across the front page. A week later, Margaret called me. Her voice was hesitant. "We were wondering, could we come by this weekend to see Lila?" I kept my tone even. "Of course." That Saturday, they arrived with a small stuffed lamb and a stack of children's books. They still didn't hold her, not yet, but Margaret knelt by her playmat and let her grab her finger. It was a start. After they left, Daniel looked at me with something like hope in his eyes. Maybe they're coming around. Maybe. But I knew this wasn't just about them anymore. The maternity wing had become more than a symbol. It was a foothold in a larger climb, and I wasn't done climbing. 2 months later, the hospital invited me to speak at a regional conference for healthcare philanthropy. It was an opportunity to share our project's story with donors from across the state. I accepted, knowing the audience would be filled with people who valued legacy above all else. In my speech, I spoke about the power of names, how they can honor, inspire, and connect generations. I told the story of the Ellison wing without bitterness, framing it as a unifying force. The applause was long and warm. Afterwards, a representative from a neighboring city's hospital approached me. "We're planning a similar expansion," she said. "Would you consider advising us?" I agreed, sensing another door opening. Back home, Daniel seemed cautiously proud. The Ellisons continued their occasional visits, still formal but no longer distant. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to take an interest in Lila's world, asking about her pediatrician, her first words, her favorite foods. Each time, I made sure to mention her full name, Lila Grace Ellison. The day the hospital called to schedule the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the wing, I stood in the kitchen with the phone to my ear, staring out the window at the backyard where Lila was toddling in the grass. The director's voice was bright with excitement. "We'd like you and the Ellisons to cut the ribbon together," she said. I smiled. "We'll be there." And in my mind, I could already see it. The cameras flashing, the gold ribbons snapping under the scissors, the Ellison name forever tied to the place where countless new lives would begin. This was only the middle of the story. The best was still to come.
The ending unfolded without fanfare, in the same family lounge where so much had begun. The light through the tall windows was warm, casting a soft glow over the small gathering. Just us, the Ellisons, and a few staff who had quietly slipped in to witness the moment. On the wall, the original Ellison letters gleamed, newly polished and anchored above a plaque that read, "A name is not a claim.
It is a promise kept together. Margaret's hand lingered on the cool metal, her thumb brushing each letter as if committing them to memory. Beside her, Thomas cradled Lila with an ease that spoke of time and effort, of moments earned, not inherited. The air carried the muffled sounds of the ward beyond, nurses' footsteps, the quiet murmur of parents in conversation, the distant rhythm of a monitor. Life continued, unbroken. We didn't speak much as we left, moving together through the atrium, our steps falling into an unplanned rhythm. Margaret carried Lila's little bag. Thomas clasped her small hand as she toddled ahead. It struck me then that the journey I had begun with resolution and defiance had ended in something softer but stronger. Connection. Not forced, not demanded, but chosen. We had not erased the past. There would still be silences, still moments where old pride flickered, but now those silences were simply pauses in a conversation that had no end. The distance was gone, replaced by a bond woven with imperfect threads and mended by showing up, again and again. In the quiet, I understood. I had fought to bring them to Lila. Somewhere along the way, they had come to all of us. And that, more than any plaque or wing or name on a wall, was the victory worth keeping. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.
I didn't sleep the night after the scholarship ceremony. The applause still rang in my ears, bright and hollow, and somewhere underneath it ran the quiet question I'd been dodging for months. Why had they stayed away? Not the story they gave Daniel, "We're not ready," but the bone-deep reason that made 2 people choose a closed door over a new pair of eyes. If we were ever going to be a real family for Lila, I needed that answer. The next morning, I dressed Lila in soft cotton and took her on a slow walk through our street, pushing the stroller beneath early summer trees that spilled dapples of light across the pavement. Daniel had gone into the office. He'd taken on a bigger project lately, the kind that stretched his days past dinner. He said it was good to focus on something concrete. I knew what he meant. I also knew busy hands sometimes meant loud thoughts. By the park, I called Margaret. She answered on the 3rd ring. Claire, her voice was alert in that careful way of hers, like stepping onto a dock that moved underfoot. "Hi, do you have a minute?" A pause. "Of course." "I'm baking this afternoon," I lied gently. "Too much for 3 people. Would you like to come by and take some home?" Another pause, a breath. "What time?" 3? She arrived exactly at 3 with flowers and a tin of butter biscuits, as if I were the one being hosted. I met her at the door with Lila on my hip. Margaret glanced at her and smiled. Small, quick, real. Inside, I made tea and set out plates for the cake I had not baked. On the counter, I rested a purchased lemon loaf on my own platter. It felt a little dishonest, but then again, the performance of family had been built on stranger fictions. We sat at the table, light slid over the oak like water. Leela smacked her lips happily against a silicone spoon and watched Margaret with unabashed interest. "I wanted to ask you something," I said, pouring tea, "and you can tell me to mind my own business." Margaret tilted her head. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous, just important. Why didn't you come when Leela was born?" She held the teacup without sipping. The silence between us wasn't hostile. It was heavy, like air before rain. She set the cup down very carefully, aligning the handle with the knife's edge. "I didn't know if I could walk into a hospital," she said. The words were so soft I nearly missed them. "Because of the wing?" I asked, thinking absurdly of the sign, the gold letters. "Because of a room with a window that looked out on a sycamore tree," she said, voice steadying like a hand finding a railing. "Years ago." She folded her hands in her lap, knuckles blanching. "We had a son before Daniel." The room went soundless. The refrigerator hummed on and then clicked off. Outside, a bird skittered across the fence.
I didn't know, I said. I meant it in the way you say, I'm listening. She continued, eyes fixed on the lemon loaf like it might anchor her. He was born early, very early. They told us to hope, and then they told us to let go. Thomas went back to work after the funeral. I washed the bassinet and packed it in a box I refused to label. I stopped going near hospitals. Even visiting friends with new babies was like standing at the edge of a cliff. Daniel came later. We were older. We were careful. When he cried as a baby, I was sure I would wake up and the sound would be gone. She finally looked at Leela, who had the spoon and a wet fist and was chewing the handle with serious dedication. Margaret's expression changed, like the window of a house warming from sun. When you called from delivery, it felt like the ground tilted again. I wanted to come. I dressed, I put on my coat, I sat in the car and… She stopped and drew a breath through her nose. I couldn't make my hands turn the key. I sat very still. There are answers that make you sorry you asked, not because they absolve, but because they change the direction of blame like a wind shift. Why didn't you tell us? I asked quietly. What would it solve? She said. It would make the grief yours, and it would still live in me. Grief is lighter when it's shared, I said before I could stop myself. Margaret smiled without amusement. Only when the person sharing it knows how to lift. We sat with that. Then I reached across and placed my hand on her forearm, skin cool beneath the linen of her sleeve. Come with us this afternoon, I said. Leela has her 6-month checkup. It's not the maternity wing, it's pediatrics on the 4th floor. Different hallways, different windows. You can stand by the door if you need to. She watched me, calculating the shape of the ask. Thomas can join us or not. This is between you and the place that hurt you. She nodded once. I'll try. I texted Daniel at work, your mom is coming to Leela's appointment today. He responded with a single ellipsis that somehow conveyed surprise, fear, hope. At 4:30, we were in the pediatric waiting room, posters of starfish and toothbrushes covering the walls. Margaret sat beside me, her hands folded so tightly the knuckles were marble. She looked like a woman visiting a country where she didn't speak the language but refused to embarrass herself by asking for directions. Dr. Hahn called us in with her calm smile, all quiet competence and kind attention. She greeted Margaret as if this was the most ordinary thing in the world. This is Leela's grandmother, I said. The word tasted like new fruit. Margaret blinked twice and inclined her head. The checkup was uneventful in the most reassuring way possible. Leela weighed a little more than last month. She gripped Dr. Hahn's finger and tried to stuff the stethoscope into her mouth. We asked about introducing new foods. Dr. Hahn recommended mashed peas, soft carrots, patience. In the hallway afterwards, Margaret leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, there was a sheen of tears she didn't wipe away. Thank you, she said, for asking me to come. Thank you for coming. I meant it down to the ground. On the drive home, Leela fell asleep in her car seat, fist still clenched around the edge of a flannel burp cloth. Margaret sat in the back beside her and watched her with a kind of concentration that looked like a prayer. When we reached our house, she placed a hand on my shoulder before she got out. I would like to hold her next time, she said. I wasn't ready today. Next time, I agreed, as if we were making plans to meet for coffee. That night, when Daniel came to bed, he lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. She told you, he said finally. She did, I said. He covered his face with his forearm. I knew about the baby, not details, just that there was a before me. We didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about anything that could crack the veneer. He turned his head towards me. Thank you for making room for the truth. It's your family, I said. I didn't make room. I just opened a window. He laughed, once not quite a sound of joy, and named the house. I did do that, and we both smiled in the dark. In the weeks that followed, Margaret came with me to the hospital more often. Not to the maternity wing, not yet, but to meetings about the scholarship and to volunteer in the family lounge where parents waited while babies slept under blue lights and beeping cups of air. She poured coffee, offered tissues, said nothing and everything with a well-timed nod. People thanked her by name. It stitched her to the building in a way grief had cut her loose from it years before. Thomas began to show up to things too. He had the kind of presence that could talk a combative room into a consensus or turn a 5-minute problem into a 3-minute solution by rearranging the order of sentences. Watching him greet custodians by name and remember the head nurse's favorite football team, I understood something I hadn't before. His reserve wasn't disdain, it was containment, the kind that keeps a dam from spilling or a room from exploding. Leela learned to clap one quiet Sunday morning. She brought her hands together with tremendous ceremony and startled herself with the sound. She looked so proud, I thought my heart would turn itself inside out. I recorded it and sent the video to both Ellisons before I brushed my hair. Margaret wrote back immediately. Bravo. May I come by Tuesday? Yes, I typed. I'll make real cake this time.
When she arrived, I placed Leela carefully into her arms. For a second, Margaret held her stiffly as if Leela were made of bone china. Then Leela reached up, grabbed a strand of her necklace, and smiled the full sunshine smile that knocks down any sensible wall. Margaret sat, pressed her cheek to the top of Leela's head, and let out a sound I had not yet heard from her, a small, astonished sigh of relief. We were getting somewhere. The hospital board asked me to chair the first-year operations committee for the maternity wing. It meant long afternoons reviewing staffing models, equitable access protocols, and what we were calling the Compassion Practice Initiative, training modules to make sure clinical excellence never came at the expense of tenderness. We piloted a program where volunteer grandparents came to sit with newborns if parents had to step out or rest. Margaret signed up for a shift every other Thursday. "This is what I can do," she told me. "When I sit, I am no one in particular, and yet I am everyone who couldn't be there." "You're you," I said, "and that seems to be enough." In the middle of all this, the construction firm reported a 12-week delay on finishing the Family Education Center, an airy suite on the second floor where classes on newborn care and feeding support would be held, a problem with materials. A vendor folded, the usual chain reaction of modern projects. The delay came with a price tag, an additional sum we hadn't planned for. "We can cover a portion from contingency," the CFO said, fingers steepled in the conference room where numbers were allowed to say the part no one wanted to say aloud. "No," I said before I had time to moderate. "We cannot pause the place where parents learn how to be less afraid." The room went quiet in the way of rooms that want to know if you're offering money or just vigor. "I can make calls," I said, "and I can host one more event." Margaret, who had begun attending these meetings as a matter of course, closed her binder. "I can make calls too," she said, "to people who don't need an event." Thomas exhaled like a man who knows which door to push. "I'll match the gap, up to half." Quietly. I turned. Quietly? He met my eyes. "We don't need more cameras. We need drywall and wiring." So we did both. Calls and checks and one small, beautiful evening in the unfinished education center itself. We strung cafe lights and rolled in a piano. A midwife played a waltz while donors stood on concrete floors and listened to 3 mothers read short letters to their newborns. No press. No name tags, no banner. People cried openly, the cleansing kind, and then wrote very large numbers on very small cards. Halfway through that night, I stepped into the hallway to breathe. Margaret followed. We stood looking at a blank wall where a mural would soon bloom. A field of wildflowers with names tucked into the petals. Every name a child born here, the field growing year by year. "Sometimes I'm angry with you," she said, conversational as a weather report.
I laughed, relieved by the honesty. Sometimes I'm angry with you too. She said, "You used our names to pull us into a building." I did, I said, "and you used your grief to stay out of it." We looked at each other, two women naming a truce and a truth at once. Margaret smiled first. "Do you know what I am most surprised by? That you like my cakes? That I can look at your daughter and not be afraid. When she sleeps on my shoulder, I'm not waiting for the sound to stop. As if the part of me that thought love was a trap door has learned to stand on the floor again." I swallowed hard. Good. We went back inside and finished the night. We met the gap and then exceeded it by a margin that bought not just drywall, but books for the shelves and rocking chairs for the corners no one budgets for. The education center would open with the wing. A week later, the hospital communications team asked if I would sit down for one more interview, a quiet profile piece about the year we'd had. I agreed, but I set a boundary. No glossy narratives, no savior storyline, no positioning the Ellensons as saints or me as anything but stubborn. The writer, a woman with a calm voice and a notebook full of very good questions, met me in the atrium and pressed her recorder between us like a shared plate. "What do you wish people understood about this place?" she asked. "That hospitals are not buildings, they're promises. And a promise is only as strong as the people who keep it." "How do you keep yours?" "By showing up, even when I don't want to." She smiled at that and closed the notebook before the recorder. That's the quote. We were walking toward the elevator when we passed the volunteer desk. Margaret sat there in her Thursday sweater, a soft blue thing that made her eyes look younger. She was signing in for her shift. The writer glanced from her to me. "Your mother-in-law?" "Yes," I said. "The first person to teach me that not all quiet is disapproval." We parted there. I went to the third floor to review crib inventory with the operations manager. On my way back down, my phone buzzed with a notification. A calendar reminder I'd set weeks ago without thinking. Soft launch prenatal class registration opens today. We were ready. The online portal was built, the schedule organized, the instructors prepped. The first class would begin in 2 weeks in the new education center. I sent the link to Daniel with an exclamation point. He replied with a flurry of celebratory emojis I didn't know he knew how to find. At home that evening, we ate pasta in the backyard while Leela banged a wooden spoon against her high chair tray as if conducting an invisible orchestra. The late sun turned the maple leaves into pieces of stained glass. I felt for a breath like a person standing exactly where she is meant to stand. Halfway through clearing the dishes, I remembered something I had promised the communications team, a short note to be read at the small community celebration scheduled for the following week. I went inside and sat with my laptop at the kitchen table, fingers hovering over the keys. Words came easily when I knew who needed them. Tonight, the words turned stubborn. I closed the laptop and carried it to the living room, where Leela had fallen asleep in her swing. I was halfway through the second paragraph when the doorbell rang. Daniel went to the door. I heard the familiar rhythms of greeting and lowered voices, and then his footsteps returning. He held out a small white envelope, my name written on it in a steady hand. From the hospital. Courier. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The final schedule for opening day. The order of speakers, the minute-by-minute flow of the ceremony. My eyes moved down the page and stopped at the final line of the last page. Dedication of the Family Education Center. Plaque unveiling. The Claire Whitfield Learning Suite.
I read it twice, then again. "I didn't ask for this," I said. "I know," Daniel said, reading over my shoulder. He kissed my temple. "Maybe someone is naming the house for you." I laughed, although my eyes stung. I am not sure I can survive this level of irony. We didn't argue about it. There was nothing to argue. It was a gesture that felt like a hand on my back, unexpected, steadying. I wrote the note for the community event in 10 minutes flat. 2 days later, on a Tuesday that began clear and turned threatening by lunch, the wind shifted, and with it came the reminder that control isn't the same as safety.
Lila woke from her nap hot to the touch. Not warm hot, scalding. Her eyes were glassy. She made a small, discontented sound from somewhere too deep in her chest for 6 months old. I called Dr. Hahn. Her nurse asked the usual questions. I answered calmly until I heard my own voice tremble. "She's breathing fast," I said, "and she won't take water." "Come in now," the nurse said. "We're open late today." I dressed Lila with hands that could not be both gentle and quick. Daniel met us at the car from the train platform, tie askew, hair damp from the humidity. Traffic moved like syrup. I kept talking to keep the car from becoming the inside of my throat. "Almost there, baby. Almost there. Almost there." We reached the clinic before it closed. Dr. Hahn listened to Lila's lungs. Her face was very still. "Her oxygen is low," she said. "We're calling ahead to the hospital. You'll go straight upstairs." "I'll drive," Daniel said, and I realized my hands were shaking so hard I couldn't have held the keys. I texted Margaret without thinking. "We're going to the hospital. Lila has a fever. Oxygen low." I wasn't asking for anything. I was telling the person who would arrive. We pulled up under the awning we had stood beneath on Ribbon Day. The doors opened like an inhale. Nurses met us with a rolling bassinet and a device that looked too small to matter, and yet was so large I couldn't see around it. They placed a tiny cannula under Lila's nose. She whimpered, too tired to protest. Margaret was already there. So was Thomas. I realized, dazed, that the text I'd sent had bled outward through their lives like dye in water. Thomas's tie was loose, Margaret's hair was pinned, but a curl had fallen near her ear. She stepped aside for the nurses, then matched my stride down the hallway with a precision that told me she knew exactly how not to get in the way. "This might be RSV," a nurse said as we passed, or something like it. RSV. The letters tumbled through my head, knocking over calm like bowling pins. The air smelled of sanitizer and warmed plastic. The hallway I had learned so slowly was now a tunnel I could run without breathing. In the room, Dr. Hahn appeared like a magician called from thin air. She touched my arm with a directed kindness that recalibrated the room. "We're going to monitor her very closely," she said. "We'll try high-flow oxygen here. If she doesn't tolerate it, we'll transfer her to the NICU so we can support her more intensively. You did the right thing by coming in immediately." Daniel stood at the head of the bassinet, his hand hovering inches above Lila's hair as if he could smooth the fever without touch. I could feel his panic like a second set of lungs strapped to my ribs. Margaret took my hand. Her grip was firm with an authority I had not known to need until that second. She said quietly, "You will breathe." A sentence without a question mark. "Now." I did. The room sharpened. Monitors traced poetry in a language I was learning to read. Peaks and plateaus, cliff edges and shelves. A respiratory therapist adjusted the cannula and cooed to Lila as if she were a niece. For an hour the numbers seesawed. Songs I didn't know I remembered queued up in my mouth. I sang them badly because I needed to, and Lila needed to hear the voice that had built the inside of her world. Daniel counted each inhale in a way that made me want to kiss his mouth just to interrupt the counting. Margaret stood like a lighthouse. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. The attending stepped in. A calm presence with the kind eyes of a person who has seen storms and still believes in docs. He studied the screen, listened to Lila's lungs again, then straightened with a decision. "We're going upstairs. NICU. She needs more support, and I want her where I can watch her minute by minute." My vision narrowed and then expanded so fast I thought I might fall. The NICU, the place where beginnings teeter between staying and leaving, the place Margaret had not walked into for decades. I looked at her. She looked at me. There was a question in the air, and it wasn't mine. "I'm coming," she said. They moved as a practiced unit. The bassinet became a spaceship, and we followed. Thomas pressed the elevator button with an efficiency that made an elevator do what it was always going to do, but faster. Inside the NICU, the lights were softer, the beeps sounded like smaller birds. A nurse with gentle hands guided us to a bay. They placed a tiny mask across Lila's face.
The sound she made was a complaint from a very old place. A resident explained the plan: supportive care, watchful hours, culture sent, words like bronchiolitis and steroids, and we'll see how she responds. I nodded and nodded until my neck ached from agreement. Margaret stood at the foot of the warmer. I watched her face as she stepped into her old fear and found it wasn't a trapdoor after all, just a room with an exit she hadn't seen yet. She reached out, resting 2 fingers lightly against Lila's ankle, a touch that said, I am here, I am here, I am here. Dr. Hahn squeezed my shoulder and slipped away, trusting the unit to their expertise. Daniel pressed his forehead to mine and whispered, We're okay, though neither of us knew the truth of that yet. Thomas spoke to the charge nurse in a quiet tone that communicated nothing but respect and the offer of any logistical help that could clear a hallway, a form, a delay. Time stopped obeying social rules. It stretched, curdled, folded. Night gathered outside the windows, and the NICU hummed with the relentless compassion of people doing tiny, enormous things. At some hour, that could have been 10 p.m. or 2 a.m., the attending returned. He looked at the monitor, then at us. His voice was gentle, but it bore the weight of a pivot. She's working too hard, he said. We're going to intubate. The room rearranged itself around the sentence. Daniel's hand found mine. Margaret drew in one breath and then another with me, like we were learning to swim. A nurse guided us 2 steps backward to give the team a clean field. The attending nodded to the respiratory therapist, who adjusted the tray with precision that made the air feel less like air and more like a plan. Okay, sweetheart, the attending murmured, to Lila. A word like a bridge between here and here. Then he looked up at us. We'll take the best care of her. The monitor chimed, small and insistent. The room held its breath, and the doctor lifted the laryngoscope.
The NICU room contracted around that single motion, the attending leaning forward, gloved hands steady, the light from the laryngoscope casting a sterile glow into the air between him and my daughter. I could feel Daniel's pulse against my palm, a rapid counterpoint to my own. Margaret had moved just far enough to give the team space, but she was still close enough for me to feel her presence like a hand pressed against my back. Tube size 3, the respiratory therapist murmured. Another nurse readied the medications, their voices blending into a practiced, reassuring rhythm. This was choreography, not chaos, though to my eyes it felt like the floor might drop at any second. I kept my gaze fixed on Lila's face. Her eyelids fluttered, her cheeks flushed too brightly with fever. She looked impossibly small under the warming lights, the elastic of the oxygen mask leaving faint impressions in her skin. The attending's voice was calm, deliberate. All right, Lila. Deep breath, sweetheart. Daniel's hand tightened around mine. He was holding his breath. I realized I was too. A nurse, catching it, gave us both a quiet nod, like a reminder to stay tethered here. It was over faster than I'd expected. The tube slid into place with a decisive ease, the ventilator's steady hiss replacing the shallow, rapid breaths that had been pulling her tiny chest too hard. The monitor numbers steadied, not perfect, but better. Oxygen climbing from the 80s into the low 90s, heart rate evening out. She tolerated it well, the attending said, looking directly at us. This will give her body the rest it needs. The infection has been asking too much from her lungs. Now she can focus on healing. I nodded, the relief immediate but incomplete. How long? We'll assess daily, he said. Could be a couple of days, could be longer. The important thing is she's stable. The word stable landed like a fragile glass ornament in my chest. I wanted to cup it with both hands, protect it from any crack. After the team stepped back, Margaret moved closer again, her hand hovering over Lila's foot before resting lightly against the blanket. Her voice was quiet but steady. She's strong. She is, Daniel said, his voice roughened as if he'd been speaking through wind. A nurse explained the sedation protocol, the checks they'd perform hourly, the lab tests scheduled for the morning.
I listened, memorizing every step, but my mind kept circling the same truth. She was breathing, the machine was helping, and we had a moment to stop falling. They brought in 2 chairs, the kind that folded out into something almost like beds, and told us we could stay by her side all night. Daniel claimed one, I took the other. Margaret remained standing for a while, as if sitting might let the exhaustion in. Eventually, Thomas appeared with paper cups of coffee and a quiet nod to the night nurse. Hours passed in the rhythm I'd never known before. Nurse checks, machine sighs, the occasional gentle beep when a reading nudged out of range. At some point after midnight, I leaned my head against Daniel's shoulder, not to sleep, but just to feel where we touched. Margaret stood on the other side of the warmer, her silhouette outlined against the glow. I realized she hadn't left the room since we arrived, not once. Around 3 a.m., a nurse gently suggested we step out for a short break, stretch our legs. Daniel hesitated, but I could see the strain in his posture. We followed her advice, walking down the hushed corridor to the small parents' lounge. The vending machines hummed, a single table lamp cast a soft cone of light over a stack of magazines no one had touched in years. Margaret sank into one of the chairs, hands wrapped around the coffee Thomas had brought hours earlier. "You know," she said without looking at us, "I wasn't sure I could do this." Daniel sat across from her. "Be here? Walk back into that room," she said. But when I saw her, her voice trailed off and she shook her head. "It wasn't the same room I left all those years ago, and she isn't the same baby. She's ours," Daniel said simply. Margaret met his gaze. "Yes, and now she's mine too." It was the closest she'd come to claiming Leela openly, without qualifiers. The statement hung between us, not as a declaration, but as an acceptance. We stayed in the lounge only long enough to convince the nurses we'd stretched. Back at Leela's bedside, I took her tiny hand in mine, careful not to disturb the IV. The sedation made her still, but her warmth was steady against my palm. Morning seeped into the NICU in slow gradients, the outside world inching its way through blinds and narrow windows. The day shift nurses arrived, exchanging quiet greetings with the night staff. The attending stopped by with an update. Her oxygenation had improved overnight. Inflammatory markers were slightly better, and they'd be adjusting her ventilator settings. "It's a good sign," he said, and I felt my chest loosen by a fraction. Visitors were limited, but the nurses allowed Margaret to remain. Thomas left briefly to bring back breakfast from a cafe down the street, croissants, fruit, and strong coffee that tasted like something from the waking world. The second day passed in that careful holding pattern, numbers improving, labs trending the right way. I began to trust the beeps as part of the background instead of alarms. Daniel read aloud from a children's book, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Margaret hummed tunelessly as she watched over Leela, the sound strangely comforting. On the morning of the third day, the respiratory therapist adjusted the ventilator and said she might be ready to start breathing more on her own. My heart leapt and stalled in the same instant. The attending confirmed they'd try reducing support later that afternoon. Margaret stepped closer to me. "You'll want to be here for that." "I'm not leaving," I replied. The trial went slowly, every number watched with the focus of a countdown clock. At first her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with careful effort. But then the numbers stayed where they needed to, and her little body began to take over more of the work. By evening the tube was out. She whimpered weakly, then cried, hoarse but strong enough to make me cry too. Daniel laughed, a wet sound that cracked into relief. Margaret brushed a fingertip over Leela's cheek. "She sounds like herself." We stayed in the NICU one more night for monitoring. The next morning, they moved her to a regular pediatric room. The walls were less crowded with machines, the beds small enough for her to look like the center of the world again. Margaret and Thomas visited daily. They brought small toys, fresh flowers, and books they wanted to read to her. On the fourth day, Margaret read aloud while I sat nearby, watching them with a feeling I couldn't name. Something between gratitude and the ache of knowing how much we'd almost lost. When we finally took her home, the house felt different. Lived in, yes, but also claimed. The Ellensons came by that weekend, and this time Margaret didn't hesitate to take Leela into her arms the second she walked through the door. In the weeks that followed, the maternity wing's final preparations resumed. I attended meetings with the renewed sense of what this place meant, not as a symbol, but as a lifeline. Margaret joined me for several of them, speaking up in ways she hadn't before, suggesting small comforts for families who might spend nights like ours. As the opening day approached, the hospital director asked if I would share Leela's story during the ceremony. She said, "It's a testament to why this wing exists." I agreed, knowing it would make the day heavier, but also truer. Margaret surprised me the night before the event. She called to say she'd like to speak too, not about loss, but about what it means to walk back into a place you swore you'd never see again and find it changed because you changed. Opening day was clear and bright, the air crisp with late autumn, the crowd gathered in the courtyard, the gold letters above the entrance gleaming in the sun. Daniel stood beside me with Leela on his hip. Margaret and Thomas were just to my left. When it was my turn, I told the story, not the whole thing, but enough. I spoke about the night we rushed here, the hands that steadied us, the machine that breathed for Leela until she could breathe for herself. I said her name, their names, and the names of the people who made that night end the way it did. Margaret followed. Her voice carried clearly, no notes in her hands. I thought I had shut the door on this place, but doors are funny things. Sometimes they open from the other side. The applause was warm, real. We cut another ribbon, this one for the Family Education Center, and when the cloth fell away from the claque, my name was there. I felt Daniel's hand squeeze mine, and for the first time, the gesture didn't feel like support. It felt like celebration. Later, as the crowd thinned and the photographers packed up, Margaret came to stand beside me. "You know," she said, "if you hadn't named the wing after us, I don't think I'd have come. And if I hadn't come, I wouldn't have stayed. And if you hadn't stayed, I wouldn't have had you with me in that room." She nodded. "Sometimes stubbornness is just love in its work clothes." I smiled. "Then we're both very well dressed." We stood there in the sun, the building casting its shadow long and wide, and I knew that whatever came next, we had walked each other through the worst and into something worth keeping.
The week after the opening felt like the first breath after surfacing. Lungs burning, eyes stinging, everything too bright and beautiful to be real. The hospital posted photos from the ceremony. Parents tagged us in stories of their babies, and for a few days I let myself believe we could have this without paying another price. Then, the email arrived. It hit my phone at 6:12 a.m., just as I was measuring oats into a saucepan, and Lila was conducting a wooden spoon symphony on her high-chair tray. The subject line read, "Urgent, inquiry regarding naming authorization." The sender was the hospital's general counsel, a woman named Alina Cortland, whom I liked precisely because she did not apologize for speaking in complete paragraphs. "Claire," it began, "we've received a formal inquiry from the State Charitable Organizations Bureau related to the naming of the Ellison Maternity Wing. A tipster alleged that the naming was done without the named party's consent, that it was used to exert undue pressure on them, and that certain donations influenced vendor selections. We are preparing a response. Please call me when you have a moment this morning." The email was clinical. It didn't say my name was attached to the complaint, but the oblique angles pointed right at me. Oats clumped in the pot. Lila banged an offbeat crescendo. I turned off the burner. "Daniel," I called. He came down the stairs with bed hair and the tie in his hand, still a boy and the man I married at once. I handed him the phone. He read. His jaw set in that way I recognized from math exams and job interviews, and the night in the NICU when he decided fear could sit in the room but not lead the meeting. "Who would do this?" he asked. "Anyone who thinks narratives are clay," I said, "and who resents that I've been the one with my hands on the wheel." He rubbed his forehead. "Could be nothing. Could be bureaucracy clearing a box. It could be a match and dry brush." I called Elena. She answered on the first ring. "I'm so sorry to start your day this way," she said, which meant it was absolutely necessary to start my day this way. "We'll handle the bureau. It's routine to follow up on anonymous tips, but because it specifically questions donor influence and naming authorization, we'll need to document the sequence, your involvement, and, this is important,
The Ellisons' consent. They gave verbal consent before the ribbon cutting, I said. The truth tasted like a stone. But the initial designation was my decision. The board approved it. The Ellisons did not sign anything until much later when they joined as ambassadors. You have that paper. I do, she said. It's helpful. It doesn't make the tip disappear. Who else received this? The board's executive committee, the CEO, will brief the full board at the quarterly meeting next week. I want you to be prepared for questions. Of course, I said. And Elena, if this turns into a story, I want it to be ours, not the tipsters. She was quiet for a beat. Understood. I hung up. Lila flung her spoon with perfect toddler nihilism. It clattered under the table. I retrieved it and kissed her forehead, feeling the ghost of the cannula and the wet white of the NICU nights. At 9, I drove to the Ellisons' house. Margaret answered the door in a cardigan I recognized from her volunteer shifts, the soft blue one with the stubborn warmth. "What's wrong?" she asked, because I hadn't texted first and I stood there without a smile. "May I come in?" In the sitting room, sunlight fell through the bay window like a straightforward blessing. Thomas joined us with 2 cups of coffee set on saucers that chimed against the table with the familiarity of habit. I told them. I didn't prettify it. I explained the inquiry, the tips allegations, the board's coming questions. I stopped before I asked what I had come to ask, because I wanted the silence to make room for their own words. Thomas folded his hands. "We signed the authorization," he said. "Late." I said, "I named it before you were ready." That's the spine of the complaint. Margaret looked at the window as if the right word might be pinned to the glass. "Is it true that you pressured us?" she asked, voice gentle but precise like a scalpel. "I weaponized narrative," I said. "I built a world where you had to step in if you wanted to keep your name from being hollow." "And did you influence vendor contracts?" Thomas asked. "No," I said. "My fundraising didn't buy drywall. It bought books and bassinet blankets. The board approved every contract by the book." "Then we answer," he said, "and we stay in the room while we answer." Margaret's eyes moved from the window to me. "I will say what is true, that you invited us into a place we had made a vow against, that we came for pride and we stayed for love." She lifted her chin. "And I will say that, if a name is a promise, we intend to keep it." I let out the breath I had held since the subject line. "Thank you." She surprised me by standing and crossing the room to take both my hands. "This is our story, Claire. Don't give it away." The board meeting was the following Tuesday. I wore a navy dress that made me feel like a person who could survive a hurricane without losing her pen. The conference room overlooked the city. The table was long enough to seat every careful face that might have an opinion. The CEO opened with the usual business, then handed the agenda to Elena for the inquiry. Elena was the kind of lawyer you wanted to hand her each of your brittle worries one by one. She laid out the facts, the tip, the timelines, the authorizations, the absence of any influence on vendor selection. She did not mention the theater of optics, because optics are not facts. Then she turned the floor over to me. I told the story in the way that had the highest ratio of truth to explanation. I admitted what I had done, named the wing to bind a name to a promise, believing that time and participation would make it right. I stated what followed: the Ellisons' consent, their work, the scholarship, the education center, the families now walking under those letters to hold their new lives. A trustee I barely knew cleared his throat. "This is all heartening," he said, "but governance requires precedent. If we allow donors, or, forgive me, energetic advocates, to name spaces without full prior authorization, we invite future conflict. Then the precedent should be to require written consent before naming, and to acknowledge that in this case we have it now. No one is asking to replicate my mistake." Another trustee, a woman with white hair and a stubborn mouth, leaned forward. "Mistake?" she asked. "Would you call it that?" "I would call it a gamble that could have broken trust. I don't regret the outcome. I regret the pressure I applied in public before I did the work in private." Her mouth softened. "Good," she said. "I prefer gamblers who name their bets." Margaret raised her hand. She wasn't a board member, but the CEO nodded to her. She stood, the cardigan like a flag no one noticed until it became a symbol. "We consented," she said. "Late, yes, but fully. No one bought our name, we brought it. And we will keep bringing it," Thomas added. "We are not interested in rescinding." The room absorbed that. Someone exhaled audibly. Elena summarized the response the hospital would send to the Bureau and the process that would follow. The meeting moved on. It might have ended there, a scare that sharpened everyone's pencils, but a scare does not satisfy people who feed on spectacle. 3 days later, a local blog with a surprising audience published a piece with the headline, "The Price of a Promise. Did a donor strong-arm a hospital?" It didn't say anything that wasn't in the inquiry, but it framed the story as a morality play with me cast as a manipulator and the Ellisons as unwilling pawns. I had expected anger in the comment section. I hadn't expected the narrative to metastasize into something uglier. Accusations of buying family, of using a baby as a leverage, of performative philanthropy. The words slid over me like cold rain and then under my skin like nettles. Daniel told me not to read them. I told him I wasn't. I lied. The hospital PR team moved quickly. They released a brief statement. The Ellisons requested no change to the naming. All contracts were approved through standard processes. The Bureau inquiry was routine and welcomed. It helped. It didn't erase the sting. Margaret called that evening. "We expected weather," she said. "We will be the umbrella." The next week, before the storm had fully spent itself, another front rolled in from a different direction. A letter from a national foundation arrived on the CEO's desk. It was an offer, an astonishingly large matching grant to expand the wing's services to include postpartum mental health support. The condition, the foundation's founder wanted naming rights for the entire complex. They would keep the Ellison name as a sub-designation, Ellison Pavilion, but the headline above the door would change. The CEO assembled a small group, Elena, the CFO, the board chair, and me. We sat around a smaller table this time, the kind used for decisions you can't make with a show of hands.
It's a once-in-a-decade gift, the CFO said. The impact would be generational. The condition is non-negotiable, the board chair said. I asked. The CEO looked at me. There is a version of this where the Ellison name moves inside, she said. A major space could carry it. NICU Family Lounge, Education Center Hall, while the exterior becomes the foundations. I heard what she didn't say. There is a version where we keep your story and lose your story's silhouette. Elena? I asked. Legally, we can change the exterior naming with board approval, she said. Ethically, we should consider the community trust invested in the current name and the fact that the Ellisons did not request removal. And practically, the CFO added, we could serve hundreds more families every year with this funding. The room held both truths and watched them glare at each other. Have you told the Ellisons? I asked. Not yet, the CEO said. I wanted your read first. I surprised myself by not answering. I thought of Margaret's hand hovering over Leela's foot, of Thomas's quiet gift at the education center, of the comment section that assumed the worst, and the NICU nurses who assumed hope. I thought of postpartum mothers staring at a wall alone at 3 a.m., with a weight they couldn't name. I pictured doors. I pictured weather. Tell them, I said, but not as a done deal, as a question we owe them. We met at the Ellisons' house that evening. The CEO laid out the proposal with her sincere, careful diction. Thomas asked clarifying questions. Margaret listened without interrupting, her fingertips pressed together like she was holding a sentence between them. When the CEO finished, the room leaned into the silence. I hate it, Margaret said finally, and I love it. Thomas nodded. It would help people. It would erase us, Margaret said, then corrected herself. Not erase us, move us. She looked at me, and it would satisfy the people who think we should be moved. I stood. I hadn't planned to stand, but sitting felt like consenting to something I couldn't articulate yet. Names are not the point, except when they are. This wing taught me that. We can accept the gift and still tell the story right. We can keep Ellison where it means something to the people inside. We can make the exterior a banner that buys more care.
Margaret's eyes filled so quickly it startled me. I don't want to give our name away because someone threatened it. I want to give it away because we chose to. Thomas exhaled. I can live with that. The CEO looked relieved and sad at once. We'll bring it to the board, she said. They will vote. The board meeting was set for Thursday. In the days before, I worked with the communications team on 2 versions of a statement. One if the board accepted the foundation's condition, one if they declined. I had never written sentences that could be both a victory speech and an obituary. On Wednesday night, after Leela fell asleep and Daniel went for a run to shut off his thoughts, I sat on the floor of her room with the lamp turned low, the kind of light that makes the edges of furniture kind and the carpet feel like a blanket. I tried to imagine telling my daughter that the name above the door had changed. I tried to imagine telling her why. There was a version of the story in which it would be simple. We chose care over credit. There was another version in which it would not be that simple at all. The next morning, the board gathered. Elena reviewed the legal framework. The CFO named numbers that could fund entire lifetimes of help. The board chair opened the floor for discussion. People spoke earnestly and well. No one was wrong. Halfway through, my phone buzzed. I let it buzz. It buzzed again and then again, an insistence that felt like fate's childish cousin. I glanced down. A text from the NICU charge nurse. Is everything all right? We had a call asking whether the Ellison name would be removed. Families are worried. Do you want to say something? I stood. Before you vote, I said, addressing the board, I need to tell you what this name means in the hallways you do not walk every day. A mother whose baby weighs less than a bag of flour waits under those letters while a machine teaches her child to breathe. The name is not a billboard to her. It is a sentence that ends in welcome. If we change it, then we owe her a better sentence, not just a different one. The board chair nodded. Thank you, Claire. The vote began. Hands rose. 2, 5, 8, 10. My pulse counted too quickly to number the hands. The board chair looked around, then down at her sheet. Motion carries, she said. We will accept the foundation's gift and proceed with renaming. The Ellison designation will be retained within the complex. A sound went through the room. Not applause and not grief. Something in between. Elena began to outline next steps. The CEO made a note. I stared at the window long enough for the city to blur.
The Bureau closed the inquiry, her text read. No findings. Case closed. The elevator's sudden stillness pressed the air against my skin like a held breath. Margaret's hand gripped the railing, her knuckles pale. Lila wasn't with us. She was at home with Daniel, but my body reacted as if she were, instinct screaming for me to shield her from the jolt. The emergency light flickered once, twice, then steadied into a dim amber glow. I pressed the call button for the intercom. Nothing. Margaret met my eyes, her voice steady but low. How often do elevators in hospitals get stuck? I tried for calm. Rarely, and when they do, there's a whole maintenance team who... A pop cut me off, a sound like static being ripped from the air. Then the intercom crackled to life. Elevator 6, we're aware of the outage, a man's voice said, calm, controlled. We've got a temporary building-wide systems disruption. Maintenance is on it. Are you both all right in there? Yes, I said. We're fine. Sit tight. We'll have you moving soon. The intercom clicked off. Margaret exhaled slowly and lowered herself onto the floor, her back against the panel. I joined her, the hum of the emergency light our only companion. We didn't speak for the first few minutes. My mind was busy cataloging the timing. An outage, right after a breaking news notification about a board member's resignation, right after I agreed to make a statement.
Coincidence was a word I trusted less and less. Margaret broke the silence. What's your statement going to be? I looked at her, weighing the words. The truth, but not the truth they're baiting for. They'll want you defensive. I know, that's why I won't be. She studied me for a long beat. And what about the grief? Mine, ours. If we use it, I corrected gently, it will be on our terms. No one gets to turn your loss into their weapon. The elevator jolted once, a mechanical shrug, then went still again. The intercom crackled. Update. We've got the generator running, but the main line to this car needs manual reset. We'll have you out in about 10. Margaret nodded to herself, as if 10 minutes were nothing. In truth, it was enough time for her to tell me something I'd been waiting to hear. I wasn't going to talk about him, about the baby we lost before Daniel, but maybe I should. If we tell it, no one else can twist it. Are you sure? I asked. No, she said, but I'm sure I'm tired of being silent. She told me then, her voice even, details I hadn't known, the name they'd chosen, but never used in public, the way the sycamore outside the hospital window was the only thing she could look at without breaking, how Thomas had thrown himself into work, and she had shrunk from the world, afraid every sound would be the last. And now, she said, there's Lila, and there's you, and this building with our name, for now. We can turn it into a story about keeping promises, even when the world tries to take them away. I reached for her hand, then we'd tell it together. The elevator shuddered, rose with a slow groan, and finally slid open to the soft light of the atrium. A small group had gathered, maintenance workers, a nurse I recognized, and the polite-voiced man from the Foundation's PR team. His relief was well performed. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "and we're ready." Margaret straightened her cardigan and stepped out with the composure of someone walking into a boardroom she owned. We crossed the atrium to the volunteer desk, where I asked for the hospital's PA system operator. Within 5 minutes, the microphone was in my hand. The atrium wasn't packed, but there were enough people, patients' families, staff, volunteers, that the hum of conversation dimmed when my voice came through the speakers. This is Claire Whitfield. Some of you know me because of the maternity wing. Some of you know me because I've been in the lounge with you at 2 a.m. waiting for a number on a screen to climb. Today you might hear a story about my family, about my in-laws, about a baby we lost before my daughter was born. You might hear it from people who want to turn grief into gossip, so I'm going to tell you myself. I glanced at Margaret, who nodded once. Before my husband was born, his parents had a son. He came too early. He didn't survive. They didn't speak about it often, but they carried it every day. When Lila was born, that grief made it hard for them to come to the hospital. That's why at first they stayed away. But they came, and they stayed. And together, we've worked to make this hospital a place where no family has to carry that kind of loss alone. That's the only truth that matters here. I let the words hang for a moment. If you hear anything else, know that it's not for you. It's for someone else's agenda. We don't live by their agenda. We live by our promises. I handed the mic back, the quiet in the atrium deep as a held breath. The PR man from the Foundation looked pale. "That was not what I expected," he murmured. "Good," I said, and walked away. Within an hour, a video of the speech was online, posted by someone who'd been in the atrium. It spread faster than the accusations had. Comments poured in. People thanking us, people sharing their own losses, NICU parents, past and present, saying the story made them feel less alone. By the evening, the Foundation's founder called me directly. "You know," he said, "most people would have tried to bury that. Burying it doesn't make it lighter," I replied. He chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "You're dangerous with a microphone, Claire. I'm careful with it. That's different." The next morning, Elena emailed me. Brilliant move. Also, I think you might have just insulated us from whatever the contractor's next play is. But even with that small victory, I knew this wasn't over. People who thrive on chaos don't just vanish, they regroup. And in the days ahead, I'd have to decide whether to stay reactive or to take the fight somewhere they wouldn't expect. Margaret had given me her answer. We tell the story ourselves. Now I had to decide how big the audience would be. That night, Daniel and I sat in the living room after Lila was asleep. The house dim except for the lamp's soft circle. I told him everything. The tipster, the contractor, the elevator, the speech. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "You know this isn't going to end until you make it end." "I know," I said. "Then do it. Just promise me one thing." "What?" "Don't burn yourself down to build it." I promised. I wasn't sure I could keep it, but I promised. The following week, I asked Elena for a meeting, not about defense, but about offense. If someone wanted to dismantle the trust we'd built, I was going to make it harder for them than they'd ever imagined. She raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" "A campaign. Not a PR one, a community one. One that makes the story too big for them to rewrite." She smiled slowly. "I think I'm going to enjoy this." We began planning, and for the first time since the inquiry began, I felt like I was running towards something instead of away.
"I have the transfers," he said, "and I'm not leaving until you look." For a beat, the lobby held its breath. Security hovered, hands open, ready but not threatening. The red light on his phone blinked insistently, live, watching eyes multiplying in the invisible air. Margaret stood at my shoulder like resolve made visible. Thomas had drifted a half step forward, not to block, but to steady the path if it tilted. I kept my voice even. "Then let's look," I said, "but not in a hallway and not on a live stream." I nodded to the charge nurse. "Family consultation room, please." To the young man I added, "You can keep your phone, you can keep the folder, but we close the door and we do this on the record." He swallowed, surprised that the door I'd offered wasn't a trap. "Fine," he said, pressing the screen to end the stream. The red light winked out. Inside the small room, 2 armchairs, a small table, a box of tissues with one corner always already lifted. He set the folder down and hovered his hand over it like he wasn't sure who owned it now. "What's your name?" I asked. "Aaron," he said. "Aaron Pike." "And you work for the foundation?" He nodded. "Finance team. I reconciled program disbursements. I saw 2 transfers last week from an account labeled Awareness Subfund. It's under the umbrella of the grant that renamed the wing. The transfers didn't go to the hospital. They went to a company called Sable Commons LLC. Elena slipped into the room like a necessary page in a book. Someone had called her before I could. She introduced herself, set her legal pad on the table, and moved a chair without making a sound. "May I?" she asked, nodding to the folder. Aaron hesitated. "He wants protection," he said. "I can't lose my job." "You want counsel," Elena said softly. "The way you translate fear into an option. We'll make sure you get it. For today, you're sharing documents you believe evidence a misuse of funds. We'll treat them as confidential and preserve chain of custody. If law enforcement needs them, we hand them over through counsel. Agreed?" He nodded. His shoulders dropped a fraction. He opened the folder. 2 wire confirmations, a memo with 3 initials in the corner of the page, someone high enough at the foundation to have initials for a name. The recipient, Sable Commons LLC. Purpose, message acceleration. The amounts were large enough to build an entire education classroom out of sunlight and chairs. "Who is Sable Commons?" I asked. "A shell. Registered last quarter. The address is a PR firm's suite. That firm's partner,
also advises the contractor who is suing you." The room seemed to tilt, in the tiny way buildings do when truth pulls at the plumb line. Margaret's hand found the back of the empty chair and held it, a woman steadying furniture because no one else could. "None of this hit our accounts," Elena said, her pen already moving. "The program dollars we receive are segregated and audited, but if the foundation diverted money that donors believed served care into AstroTurf and pressure campaigns, that's its own story." Aaron flipped to a second memo. It was more explicit. Earned media amplification, coalition influence, blog coordination. The blog's name appeared in a bullet point like it was a line item at a grocery store. "Why come to me?" I asked. "Why not your board or the press?" "Because you don't owe the founder anything," he said simply. "And because you'll make it about the families, not about winning." I sat back. I had wanted a clean ending, a neat knot. What I'd been given was a frayed rope with enough length to hang a reputation and a chance to tie something better. "We'll do this right," I said. "No hallway trials. Elena will contact the foundation's general counsel and their board's audit chair today. We'll ask for an independent investigation with full disclosure. Meanwhile, our programs continue. No parent will feel this in the waiting room." Aaron exhaled, sound like permission, and slid the folder toward Elena. She photographed each page for contemporaneous record-keeping, logged the time, then sealed the originals in an envelope and signed the seal. Process was its own kind of kindness. When we stepped out, the lobby had thinned, but not emptied. News traveled in buildings the way it always did, like electricity, like rumor, like wind. I put my hand on the volunteer desk and spoke just loudly enough for the people who needed to hear. "We received documents alleging misuse of the foundation's ancillary funds. Not hospital funds, not program dollars sitting behind our counters. We're sending them to the appropriate people. We will protect anyone who tells the truth. And we will keep our promises today, tomorrow, and the dull Tuesdays after that." I did not take questions. Some rooms deserve statements, not debates. By late afternoon, the foundation's general counsel had looped me into a video conference with their board audit chair, two outside attorneys whose faces looked like neat folders, and the founder himself. His smile was gone. His voice, when it came, sounded less lacquered. "We will hire an independent forensic firm," the audit chair said. "Full authority, full access. If people at the foundation misdirected funds, they will be removed. If we need to restructure the grant to ensure hospital independence, we will do that." I nodded. "We'll cooperate on the condition that parents aren't made props. No press conferences in hallways, no apologies that turn the camera back toward you." The founder flinched, then inclined his head. "Agreed." The next days were bureaucratic and blazing. The outside firm set up in a conference room with laptops and a scanner that hummed like a faithful insect. Aaron retained counsel through a whistleblower nonprofit Elena had recommended, and when the interviews began, he sat straighter than he had in the consultation room. Truth can be a chair.
The contractor's lawsuit stumbled under the weight of its own theater. A judge with a gift for footnotes dismissed it with a flourish of case law and a sentence that sounded like an exhausted parent. Courts are not instruments for public relations campaigns. He denied the contractor's motion to amend with prejudice. The word landed like a door that didn't need to be slammed to be final. The Bureau sent the hospital a letter that had the shape of vindication. They were referring the resigned board member's conduct to the state's ethics office and a prosecutor who did not enjoy being used. Elena didn't smile often. She did then, briefly, like a weather vane acknowledging the wind's better choice. Meanwhile, the work kept happening. The digital wall of promise gathered new lines and lit them each evening at dusk. The education center's rocking chairs developed the faint crescent bruises of good use. Margaret's Thursday shift at the NICU became a fixture.
Nurses planned around the way her presence lowered the temperature of an anxious room. Thomas, who had once been the king of measured distance, began spending an hour each week with facilities, learning names and routes, asking the sort of questions that only change things if you're willing to carry the answers. One late afternoon, as I was leaving a meeting about expanding postpartum mental health screens to pediatric well visits, the kind of boring change that saves 100 lives slowly, I passed the family lounge and stopped short. The original Ellison letters had been mounted above the far wall the previous Sunday, sunlight catching on the gold like memory made visible. Beneath, the new plaque read, "The Ellison letters, once above a door, now above a hearth. A name is not a claim, it is a promise kept together." Margaret was sitting beneath it with Lila curled against her chest. She was reading a board book about a bear who made pancakes. Lila punctuated every page turn with a satisfied oomph that sounded like a family trait. "Come sit," Margaret said, without looking up. I did. She finished the book and traced the bear's flour-dusted nose with her finger. I used to think an ending was silence. Now I think it's a room. I said, "Rooms echo, but only with what you've put into them." She smiled, the kind that puts a small crease near the eye that you have to have earned to see. "Then let's keep putting in the right things." The independent audit came back 8 days later. It was unsparing and exactly what the moment required. The Awareness Subfund had been used by a senior foundation executive, those 3 initials, to route message acceleration dollars to a PR shop that in turn had paid the blog and a political action committee with a name like a shrug. None of the hospital program dollars had been touched. The founder had not authorized the scheme, but had benefited from its pressure. The executive resigned before the board could fire him. The foundation's board issued a public apology that named the public and not itself, and transferred the remainder of the subfund to a new, independently administered trust restricted to on-the-ground services. They added an equal amount, unasked, with a sentence that sounded like repentance without costume. Reporters called. I told them the only version of the story that mattered. Parents would still find diapers and chairs and hands when they needed them. The rest was governance, important, but not the headline in a hallway where a monitor beeped. The blog wrote one last piece, a choked attempt to frame the audit as vindication of scrutiny. The comments were mostly parents telling their own stories, the sort of crowdsourced truth that makes spin look like what it is when you hold it in good light, threadbare. On a drizzly Saturday that made the city smell like wet paper and coffee, we held a small gathering in the family lounge to mark the audit's close, not with a victory lap, but with cookies and a new stack of donated paperbacks. The plaque gleamed despite the gray. Nurses came on their breaks. Housekeeping staff came because rooms do what they're asked to do when the people who clean them feel invited. A father with ink in his fingers read to his son in a voice that made the book better than its writing. After, we drifted out into the atrium. The light through the high windows argued with the rain and lost gracefully. Daniel lifted Lila the way people do when they're not thinking about whether they have a right to, just because a child wants to see a thing from higher up. She laughed the particular laugh she saved for ceilings. We walked together toward the doors, past the volunteer desk where so many storms had begun and ended, past the elevator that had once trapped us between floors and become by accident a waiting room where truth had asked to be told, past the wall where the digital promises would glow again at dusk. All the battles I had thought would define this year now looked small beside the ordinary labor of keeping a promise alive, showing up when it would be easier not to, telling the truth before someone else weaponized it, moving a name from a door to a hearth when the wind changed, remembering that family is the work of translation, not conquest. At the exit, Margaret touched my arm. She said, "You dragged us here, and then you stayed when we could have left." I said, "I'd change you with gold letters, Riley." She replied, "You handed us the key and a room." We stepped into the rain. Daniel unlocked the car. Lila kicked her feet, protesting the end of anything, even a walk to the parking lot. Thomas buckled her in with a competence that read now,
to anyone watching, as love. At home, after dinner, after bath, after the short parade of bedtime rituals that always feel to me like stitching the day shut, I stood at the window with the light off and watched the dark hold the street. Somewhere across town, the letters above the education hall were turning warm under the early evening fixtures. Somewhere closer, a nurse was tying a volunteer smock at the neck and saying thank you as if it was the longer sentence it always is. Somewhere below, our daughter breathed and turned her head toward the door in sleep because even asleep, she knew we would come when she called. I had started this year with a plan sharp enough to cut. I was ending it with a practice. Listen, invite, hold, repair. The plaque in the lounge wasn't a triumph, it was instruction. The ending unfolded without fanfare, the way endings worth believing often do. Not in a speech, not in a headline, but in the small choreography of a family leaving a building whose promises had become their own. We had not erased the past. We had learned to write over it without crossing it out. The distance was gone, replaced by a bond mended in public and in quiet rooms. Anchored to letters that now watched over a waiting area where people learned, hour by hour, how to be brave with their hearts. If you walk into that lounge a year from now, you won't see our names unless you look for them. You'll see a grandmother in a soft blue sweater learning the weight of sleep against her shoulder again. You'll see a man who once spoke like he was in a meeting, kneeling to tie a shoelace. You'll see a mother holding a folder and not trembling when a stranger says, "Let's look together." You'll see a wall that says nothing and means everything. A name is not a claim, it is a promise kept together. And if you step back into the atrium at dusk, you'll see the old sentences bloom on brick again, joined by one more that someone submitted without a signature, and that I will take into my bones as long as they can hold it. We keep each other's names when we keep each other. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.